All right, good morning officially. As we get started. I want to have a good weekend. See you tonight. I had an amazing day yesterday. The best day. 2 cakes. We had a big party, but Tom Brady unretired. It made my whole day. I don't know if anyone else saw that, but I texted everyone I know, he's unretired for a day. I don't know, he'll probably change his mind again, but apparently he's coming back for another season. So that made my life so much better. I'm such a big Brady fan. I even have my number 12, goat on my phone. So one more year, maybe, unless he gets hurt or changes his mind, right? I think his wife was tired of him. Spent 40 days at home with his wife, and he's like, I'm going back to football. Right? Maybe, I don't know. Either way, I found yesterday exciting for that reason. So I'm happy about that. But yeah, otherwise, we have 2 more weeks till spring break. So I hope you're all hanging in there. I kind of feel like everyone has that tired halfway through the semester look. So it's definitely coming. We get a whole week off. So hang in there. It's 2 weeks away. It's coming up. I want to talk, obviously we'll get back to this, right? I have that we covered binge eating disorder, but that's where we stopped, right? We'll get to this in a little bit. I want to talk about the QPR speaker. You all had a much better experience than my Tuesday, Thursday class, so you should feel lucky. She was 20 minutes late to that class, but insisted on doing everything, including the role play. Give them 30 seconds for the role play, and then ask them if any of them asked the question, and they all said no. But I don't know how you all felt about the presentation. Does anyone have any thoughts? Was it helpful? Was it not so much? Or it just stays between us, I won't email Alice and tell her, but any feedback or reactions? Was it helpful, interesting, not so much? Anything at all? I got one nod. Do you have a thought?
Yeah, it was good. I mean, I haven't found a lot of that I can think of in the school life.
Yeah.
Especially if it's that.
Okay, and so a little bit helpful. Anybody else? Yeah.
Using that necessary and addressing it other 6 months starting at the class.
It's obviously it's not an easy topic, right? I imagine a lot of you, if not all of you, know somebody who has been suicidal or attempted suicide or completed suicide. It was honestly my least favorite part of being a therapist when I was working to become one. When somebody says that they're suicidal, you hope that they come out. And I would lose sleep over it, just hoping that they would be okay. Sometimes you have them sign contracts and things like that. But still, if somebody's intensely suicidal, it can be very difficult, to handle emotionally, whether they're close to you or it's somebody you care about or a client. My own personal philosophy, and I was talking about this with Allison when it presented, is I've always believed it's better to overreact and do too much and have somebody maybe be mad at me for a moment because I cared too much than to underreact and wish I had done more when I can't go back and change it. So that's always been my personal and professional stance on it. I have family members who say I'm going to kill myself over the smallest thing, and I know they don't mean it, so I never react to that, right? My brother, whenever anything bad happens, he's like, oh, I'm just going to kill myself. That's not really funny, but I know it's not serious. He said it his whole life, right? So I know not to react to that. But I've had students, I've walked my time here, I've been here 13 years, I've walked 15 students to the health center who were suicidal. And I remember every time because there's a level of concern, and I would rather overreact and rather than underreact. So it's always been my personal philosophy, and I have had people be mad at me. She said that she always says that the people will be mad at you. I've had people be upset, but it's usually short term. Later, I've had many people come back and be like, I'm so grateful that you did react and sorry I was upset. At the time, people will forgive you for caring too much, but can you forgive yourself for not doing enough? That's always just been how I've approached it. But I think it's better in general just to take people seriously, do any of the things that she talked about, whether that's asking a question and checking in with them. Sometimes just being with somebody is enough, right? Just keeping them company, not leaving them alone. It doesn't always have to be that you call the police or you get them connected to counseling. It could be as simple as just giving them a hug and staying with them so they're not by themselves. But I'll definitely ask you a couple of questions. At the very least, what does QPR stand for on the next exam? So hopefully you're paying attention. If you weren't here, I did record it and posted it So hopefully you were able to watch that. But any other like comments or thoughts, anything? I'm not going to cover chapter 7, so we can talk about it for a little bit here if you have questions.
I don't know, I didn't I have personal, I had personal suicidal tendencies and I have friends who've had suicidal tendencies.
Sure.
But I've never had to actually approach them with the question, you plan to kill yourself.
Yeah.
Thing. So having to role play that, even me and my partner, we found it just oddly ridiculous. Everything that was on the person's list was my dog of 10 years. And in the moment it seems utterly ridiculous, but at the same time, people do get suicidal illusions. So it was just we kind of felt awkward about it.
Yeah.
in a way, and so we made light of it, even though we knew how heavy the subject actually was.
Sure.
But even just role playing, messing around, it was still really hard to actually ask the question itself.
Yeah. And role plays are so awkward, right? They're awkward. It's really hard to get a sheet and be like, okay, now act, right? Unless you are good at acting, that it's difficult and it's awkward and it can be awkward in real life too. And so I love the idea that I'm going to make you ask the question and go through it so that you've done that. But yeah, it's hard. And to ask somebody directly, are you thinking of hurting yourself? It's intense, right? And I don't know if I can tell you honestly, it ever gets any easier. I was telling Allison on that day, and it might be an overshare, but I don't want to share it with you. Was it last week on the day that she came in was the anniversary of my dad's death, right? And on that day, my mom is always she has a bunch of those clues. Every year, it's she says, she's saying goodbye almost, right? She apologizes for things that she did wrong. And it's she's trying to make peace, and it scares me every year. And I have to ask her every year, Mom, do I need to worry about you today? And she never gives me a straight answer ever. And so it's my brothers and I calling her all day just to make sure she's all right. And then when that day gets by, she's okay again. But so people have triggers for them. And I mean, it's never easy to ask those questions, but if it's somebody well, you probably have an idea. You might not even need to ask them because if it's a close friend of yours or a family member, you're going to see those things, right? Or you likely will see those things, especially if you're trying to look for them. So I think I think it's a helpful little workshop. I love that you get that certificate. Please, when you're applying to transfer or you're applying for a job in psychology, put that on there, right? That, any little thing is helpful, and that definitely looks good on an application. Any other comments, thoughts, anything else related to that before we move back here? Just wanted to check in with you on it and see how you're thinking about it. Again, you got the better one, so I think it was nice that you got the full experience. And somebody had asked afterward about cutting. I don't remember who asked. Somebody in here had asked her afterwards, cutting her wrist sign was a US, right? And it can be, right? Sometimes as part of certain disorders, sometimes people will self-harm. But interestingly, she was talking about after class, cutting can actually be a coping strategy. Right? It's obviously not maybe the best one, but it can be. Sometimes people who harm themselves, it's their way of satisfying that part of themselves that is hurting them, maybe wants to hurt themselves without going any farther. Or it could be a way of having an outlet for emotions that you can't handle, so you do something physical to release them. So just to kind of comment on that a little bit, I know a couple of people who were listening to that conversation at the end, and I think that it's important. If you see somebody who's harming themselves, it is a red flag, right? That something is going on. Maybe they're not suicidal, but it's a flag, right? And so it might be something to check in with them on, even if it's not, are you thinking of killing yourself? Just, are you okay? What's going on? Is there anything I can do to help you? Very common with a borderline personality disorder, for example, but not so much, not always a red flag, but it can be. All right. So again, I'm not going to cover chapter 7 since she went over that. So at some point, make sure that you do look over those slides and read through the chapter. And you'll of course have a study guide for the next exam, but I will definitely ask you what QPR stands for. And then there's a couple of statistics that she shared that are also in the slides. So if you see it twice, it will definitely be on the exam. But again, you'll have a study guide for that and don't need to worry about it for a little bit. All right, so we'll go back here to where we left off. And it feels like a while ago at this point, right? But we did cover the three main eating disorders, right? We talked about anorexia, right, which is somebody having a distorted body image, fear of gaining weight, being less than 85% of the weight that is expected, distorted view of yourself, and kind of and then bulimia, we talked about the compensatory behaviors and the binging that people tend to engage in, and then binge eating disorder, where people binge but don't purge. And again, this one tends to lead to a lot of weight gain because there's no compensating for the amount of food that you've consumed. So what we'll do today is we'll talk a little bit about causes and treatments. And then I have a little case study that we'll do at the end to kind of pull it all together. I think it's really good practice of looking at symptoms and things like that. But when we talked about causes of eating disorders, we view it as a multidimensional risk perspective. And, honestly, you could say this for any disorder, right? The more factors that you have, the probably more vulnerable you are. But it's definitely true here, right? When people have several factors working together, it can make you very vulnerable to a particular disorder. And in this case, we're talking about eating disorders. So there's a bunch of psychological factors, interpersonal ones, a few biological ones, and then some social and cultural ones as well. So let's take a look at what some of these are. I'm going to write some of them up here. The psychological ones, right? Ones that are having to do with like your thinking, your mood, your experiences, things that are more like within yourself. So things that are common here: low self-esteem, anxiety and mood disorders, there's a lot of we call comorbidity, which means disorders like going together. There's a lot of comorbidity between anxiety and mood disorders and eating disorders, right? That people who struggle a lot with their anxiety or control or mood tend to be a little bit more vulnerable, right? There's a strong correlation between the two. We also see feelings of a lack of control being very common. I can't control my life, but I can control what I put in my body and what I eliminate from my body. But there's a lot of control involved in eating disorders. A lot of people use them as a way to try and establish control over something in their life. That's actually very, very common. And then a few other things that we could add, like cognitive disturbances, your thinking. Very common that people's thoughts play a big role, right? Like the way that you're viewing yourself and the things that you're saying about yourself, right? Maybe not understanding like what is a healthy number of calories to put in your body for your height and your weight, for your age, right? And so those like kind of maladaptive thoughts or like inaccurate thoughts that you have about yourself or about the world can play a big role in like contributing to eating disorders. So all of these things are kind of more within yourself, those feelings of inadequacy or low self-esteem, anxiety and mood disorders, lack of control, negative thinking patterns, all of those tend to play a big role in terms of psychological factors. Interpersonal ones. Interpersonal means between other people, right? So we're adding other people into the situation. And these ones I think are really big, right? I think these ones can play a big role. Your family culture. Around food. Every family has a different food culture. Everybody, right? Super easy example, and maybe it doesn't 100% equate to this, but my partner's family, when I met her like 19 years ago, they never ate dessert. Their family has a lot of people in it who have diabetes. They don't tend to eat a lot of sugar, so they'd eat dinner, no dessert. It's the saddest thing ever for me, right? I was like, "Where's the dessert?" Never came. I would go home and get it myself. And my family, on the other hand, is like, we eat dessert for no reason. Like, let's have dessert instead of dinner, which is probably completely unhealthy, but that's okay, right? My family was like, we have dessert every time, right? Little things like that, right? And now what's kind of funny is after 19 years, her parents know to bring dessert. Like, I've conditioned them. I've won the battle. There's always dessert now. Because I've kind of become part of that culture after 19 years and made some shifts to it, some good ones, right? Dessert every time, it's a good shift. So the culture that your family has, the things that your family says related to food, right? My father-in-law always looks at my mother-in-law and says, "Are you really going to eat that, Susan?" And I'm like, "Are you serious?" Like those little messages, right? "Are you going to eat that? You really don't need to eat that. Clean your plate," right? Like you need to eat everything there. Those little things that people say in your family can play a big role in influencing how you view food and how you view being full and how much you should eat and so on. All right, so family culture and your parents' attitudes, we can add that. Those attitudes around food, right? If you grew up in a family that is very much about like weight loss or being fit or exercising, being really athletic, right? There's messages that come with that. Versus some cultures, it's all about like eating a lot of food, right? Like my partner's family, very like traditional Hispanic like family. Every time we go there, it's like eat. They're like shoving food at me. I'm like, I am full, and they're like, eat more, right? And that's just like that culture, right? Which is, you know, maybe more down here, but it still goes with family culture and attitude. Everybody has that different environment, and we're soaking those things up, especially as kids, right? Like what's okay and what isn't, and what's normal and what isn't, and so on. Right? A lot of you nodding. I mean, any like comments or stories or thoughts here about things that in your family, or yeah, I'll go here and then I'll go over there.
My dad is like one, he like, so he married my stepmom and she's from China and she has a son who came here when he was like 7 years old, maybe 6. He's older now, but at the time he was around like 8 or 9 years old, and we went out for sushi. And he had like maybe one bite of a California roll and was like, "I'm full," like that. And like I was like, "You had one thing." And he like was just brushing it off. My dad was like, "Oh, he doesn't need to eat anymore." But like he was like, you know how little kids are like on the chubbier side because they still have to like grow.
Yeah, right.
So like he was the healthy weight, but my dad didn't see that. And he was like, he doesn't need to put more weight on. And I was just like, that's not okay.
Yeah. Yeah, but those messages, right? Like they're there. I mean, I imagine all of you, maybe one way or the other, have heard something to that extent, whether it's you need to lose weight or gain weight or something like that. Yeah. Did you have a thought too?
Like for in terms of like using the female Hispanic households can confirm. My grandma wants to just like stuff people.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and it seems so stereotypical, but it is often true, right? Stereotypes often come from somewhere. But yeah, every time I go to a family gathering, I'm literally being shoved food. Like, I'm good, you guys, next stop. Unless it's cake. But always, just like you need to eat, you're too thin. Like whatever weight we're at, you're too thin. Very, very common.
But there's not another mix messages that I like like.
Yeah.
My mom and she might share a relationship with me, so I kind of passed down somehow that mix message of I don't eat too much, but then also eat because you're too thin.
Yeah.
What are you gonna do?
Yeah, that's confusing, right? And that's so common that one parent feels one way and maybe the other feels a different way. Or if you have multiple parents raising you, or maybe like multiple figures that are raising you, there's often mixed messages, which can be confusing. And yeah.
My friend's mom used to be a paladin, so when she was being raised, her parents were always like pressure her to be thinner. So she I don't know what it was.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, it's one of many factors that we're talking about, but you add, you know, the culture of dancing and being a ballerina, there's often a very strict like weight and appearance expectation that goes with that. And then the expectations of the parents, right? Yeah, I mean, sadly, it happens a lot, right? I mean, I listen to it all the time, and just the messages that people say to each other. And sometimes they're really subtle, and other times they're very blatant, right? It can be just a whole range. But your family culture, your parents' attitudes, we could add to this any kind of bullying or teasing. So if you've ever been bullied or teased about your weight, your appearance, the things that you're eating, you know, any kind of ridicule or teasing, that can play a big role. I will share with you that when my daughter was in kindergarten, she was bullied and teased for her weight, and I was ready to go to jail because I like wanted to kill this little kid, right? I feel bad saying that, but it's so true. Addison It's still her name. I remember her years later. Any Addison I meet, I'm like, I don't like, but, like my partner and I were literally like, who's it gonna be? Who's going to jail for taking out Addison? But my oldest, Kaya, she's 9, and she's always been a little bit bigger. Like she came out bigger, she's got a bigger frame, like absolutely nothing wrong with, she got my stomach, all right, I feel bad. But she's always been a little bit on the bigger side. It's actually finally starting to level out now as she gets taller. It's leveled out a little bit. But in kindergarten, we noticed she started coming home and with her lunch, not eating, right? Like she'd come home and she'd still have her whole lunch. And she's like, oh, I was playing or I was busy, I didn't have time, in like limited kindergarten vocabulary. Right? And this happened for like 3 weeks. And we're like, hey, like you gotta eat your lunch, like you're gonna be hungry, like you gotta stop playing and eat your lunch. And it came out finally after like a month that she wasn't eating her lunch because this little girl, Addison, again, right? Like I should let go of the hate. It's been years, but she's still there. She's still a bully. Not my daughter's class, but still a bully. And this girl was telling her, like, you can't eat that food. It'll make you fat, right? Don't eat that. It'll make you fat. Those are bad foods. Like my mom tells me what's good food and bad, and that's bad. Don't eat it. So my poor daughter wasn't eating lunch because this girl was calling her fat and telling her the food in her lunch was bad for her. And so it became this whole thing. We had to have like a big meeting. We talked to the mom. Like that kind of stuff isn't tolerated very much now, like it maybe was, in the generations previous. But being bullied or teased like that, my daughter would come home and she's like, how do I get rid of my tummy? Like, how do I do sit-ups? And I'm like, if you want to do sit-ups, we'll do them with you. Like, be happy to do them with you, but you're perfect the way you are. Like trying to counter that and being bullied or teased for your weight can really, really sink in and cause issues. And kids have a tendency to tease each other, right? And pick on those weaknesses. And so this is a big one here, right? Family attitudes, the things other people say, bullying and teasing. And again, I'm still ready to go to jail to take out Addison. Like literally every year, it's like, is she in your class? Yep. Okay, she's bullying somebody on what now? Someone needs to, like, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
She's too bad. And to this day, she still remembers who said it.
Yeah.
When it was said, and like just a lot of what people say will have to be there.
Yeah.
Because you have
And-
no.
Exactly. And little things like that, right? Like one thing that somebody said years and years later, maybe her whole life, that might be there. Those little things have a way of staying with us. The pictures that people clearly do, right? Like if someone has, usually now it's like on technology, but like if the picture we choose of somebody is when they were super thin versus how they are now, that sends a message, right? Like those little things like that can play a really big role. Was that
I had a roommate who suffered with eating and movement disorder, and she would like speak it out on me, but super passive about it. Like I'm really gym. She's like, oh, I'm so proud of you. Or like I'm eating, she's like, we're eating together. But like in my mind, I was like, am I being too sensitive, or is she's making me about this? Because we're being mean.
right? It's hard. That's her reality, right? Like it's hard not to impose our realities on other people at times. So it sounds like it was, not blatantly obvious, but definitely there, right? Like I'm proud of you when things that she considers appropriate. Or like you're gonna eat again, like again, those little messages, can seep in for us, for sure. Then again, you're like, no. All right, any other thoughts or comments or stories or anything? Again, this is a big one. We could also add any history of like abuse. Here's another like strong correlator if people have like abuse at some point in their life, whether it's physical or emotional or sexual, that like tends to correlate a little bit with this as well. But I would say, the things that people are saying, the interactions, the things that your friends are saying or doing, all of that can play a role. The biological one, I'm not going to write anything up here, but it can be genetic, right? So for biology, all we would really say is that this is something that could be passed down and be genetic. There's a structure in the brain called the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is the structure that regulates our hunger. You know, how hungry are we, monitoring like signals in the body and our blood sugars and all of those things. And, you know, so sometimes we can have problems where the hypothalamus isn't doing the job correctly. Now, if it's 100% the role of like the hypothalamus, then we call it more of a medical issue. But it can obviously be a part of this whole dynamics. So genetics, you know, some issues with maybe structures in the body that are monitoring these things. But it's definitely the smaller of these. It can't be the only issue, or it would be more of a medical condition. The last one, and I'll erase this right in. So societal or like cultural factors. Lots of things here as well, right? And this kind of builds on the interpersonal stuff. Now we're just looking at a little bit broader. We have a lot of very narrow definitions of beauty in our culture. If you open any like pop culture magazine and you look at the people in the ads, it's almost like cookie cutters. Right? They're so digitally manipulated. They all have the same body shape and size and type, and they all look perfect, almost like digitally airbrushed, right? And they are. But there's a very narrow definition of beauty in our culture, right? And oftentimes beauty is equated with thinness, especially for women. For men, stereotypically, it's more being like muscular and bigger. But like norms in our culture, so we could add that on here, norms, like definitions of beauty, right? The things that we portray in the culture, like in our media, in our magazines and on TV and commercials, all of those things tend to play a big role. We also value physical appearance really heavily. We put a heavy value on physical appearance. Right? Our culture very much emphasizes like outward beauty or physical beauty, much more so than like inner beauty or inner strength, right? It's something that we pay a lot of attention to. So these kind of narrow definitions, glorifying thinness, portraying it constantly in the media, we get bombarded with it, right? And you may not consciously think about it, but it does kind of seep in over time. And I think most of us know that the things that we see in the media are like manipulated and altered. But when you're looking at them constantly, you don't always consciously remember that. Yeah.
We don't really pay attention to it. Usually when we're talking to little kids, for the girls, we'll be like, wow, you're so pretty. That dress you have on is really pretty.
Yeah.
Your doll is beautiful kind of thing. And then for guys, it's like, wow, look, you're so strong.
Yeah.
Like that's so fast.
Mhm.
And everything. It's very like heavily structured on
Yeah.
those images. Like we're never like, wow, look at you live that big little girl.
Yeah, it's so true, right? And it starts instantly, like from birth. Like the first thing we want to know when someone has a baby, is it a boy or a girl, right? Like right off the bat. And then there's all these gendered things that come with it. And we do tend to value, you know, strength for boys and like, you're so pretty for girls. And I think it's come a long way, but it's still something that's very much there. I remember when we found out we were pregnant with Kaya, with our daughter, it was like the pink rolled in. You're like out of nowhere, like everyone sent us pink stuff. You know, and like a little bit of pink was fine, but we didn't want to have all pink, right? It's so ingrained, right? Those gender norms and the ways that we talk to boys versus girls and so on, even when they're really little. And I'm sure most of you have seen it. It's quite old at this point, like at least like 12, 13 years old, maybe a little more. But Dove is like a really a company that has spent a lot of time talking about like beauty and changing beauty norms. And again, the things that we see in the media are so digitally manipulated. And as I said, I think we all know that, but it's easy to forget it when we're just bombarded with it. But I want to show you that Dove Evolution ad, and I'm sure most of you have seen it at some point, but just to make sure that you have. You can see in this example, right, like they bring somebody in and it's like, we're going to make you look as good as you possibly can with makeup and styling. And then they go one step farther and make this person just completely not real anymore, right? By like digitally manipulating. So let me play that for like out and about in the world. They often look absolutely nothing like the part of them that you might see like on TV or in the media in some way. just the amount of like digital manipulation that we do is incredible. But again, we're looking at these images all the time. You don't see people like yourself or people who look like you or act like you or like have the weight that you have, right? It tends to play a role, you know, and maybe it could lead to depression or it could lead to eating disorders and so on. So our cultural factors are very, very strong, right? Along with the other ones. And the more of them that you have, the more vulnerable that you might be to developing an eating disorder. Any other comments or stories or thoughts or anything else here? We'll talk about the causes next, but I mean, the treatments next, but anything else? So, treating anorexia and bulimia, slightly different goals for each, right? Because they are obviously different disorders. But with anorexia, the main goals of treatment, the first one is to restore someone to a healthy weight. Now, that sounds like it might not be like a huge thing, but it's an incredibly big ordeal, right? And this can make somebody incredibly upset. It might have to be done by force, or maybe through like feeding tubes and things to that extent. If someone isn't eating and they're very, very underweight, getting them to eat and get their weight to something that is healthier is an incredibly difficult thing to do. All right, so sometimes this can require like hospitalization or somebody going to like an inpatient facility where like in the documentary promo that I showed you, but getting somebody to a healthier weight is step one. But so we can reduce the medical issues and the like, you know, any risk factors that they have physically. And then trying to treat the things that are underlying the eating disorder. Where did it come from? You know, what were there messages that like led to it? Or were there things that somebody said to you that contributed to it? Is it related to depression or anxiety? Like finding the source of it, which isn't always easy to do, of course, right? But the more you can identify like what is driving it, the better it is to like attack it for treating, right? Like, so if it's somebody it's being led by depression and it's related to control, we're going to approach that differently than if it's like, you know, related to body image and exclusively like weight or something someone said. So trying to identify, you know, the issues that caused it, the underlying factors, and then working to eliminate or reduce any of the behaviors that might lead to disordered eating or like might cause relapse in some way. Maybe the people you hang out with are a big part of why you have an eating disorder, right? Like your friends and the culture of your friends. So how can we identify that and maybe reduce your likelihood of having a relapse? Relapse is so high with eating disorders because, again, think how often we have to deal with the idea of being hungry and eating, right? So trying to look at what are some of your triggers? Is it a certain time of year, certain time of day? Is it stressors? Is it a certain person, right? And how might they be contributing and how can we help you to have a plan so it doesn't cause you to relapse? So again, getting someone up to a healthy weight, trying to find like the underlying issues, and then either through like therapy or like a variety of techniques, you know, reducing some of the disordered eating habits, kind of reconditioning someone and identifying things that might lead to relapse. Now, bulimia is very similar, but the big thing here is we have to stop the cycle. Bulimia is a very like cyclical disorder, right? Somebody eats and then they purge. And so oftentimes what we do is we have somebody eat and then we don't let them purge. Now they might cry and be very upset and very like agitated, but it's almost like you're on watch, right? I'm not going to let you do anything that would allow you to get rid of that weight that you or the food that you just put in, breaking the cycle, right? Very much like you would do with OCD when we talked about OCD, like the mom who had the germs, right? You have somebody who has obsessive compulsive disorder, you expose them to something that causes them anxiety, and then you don't let them do anything to feel better, right? Again, this is very upsetting for people, but you're trying to break the habit of binging and then purging through like an exposure and then preventing that response.
Like bulimia is eating like specifically, like is there a high rate of like, people, like if you have OCD or too much love, like how specifically?
Not necessarily. I mean, it happens, but there's not like an incredibly high correlation between the two. But you can see how there's a little bit of like overlap, especially in treatment, right? So it might be that people develop like very meticulous rules around eating, which would overlap a little bit with those OCD kind of tendencies or ways that it presents. It happens, but I wouldn't say it's high, but it definitely can occur that way. where anxiety is one of the personal or psychological factors that can play a role. So breaking that cycle, individual and group therapy. Group therapy is a very common treatment for eating disorder, right? And group therapy is traditionally where you have like a group of people all struggling with the same issue, and then they meet with one therapist or maybe two, depending on the size of the group. But the wonderful thing about group therapy, especially here, right, is it gives you this sense of like, I'm not the only one, right? There's a sense of like other people are going through the same thing that I'm going through. And these people understand what I'm going through, right? Because somebody might be like, I ate a piece of pizza last night and I didn't throw it up. I didn't do anything to get rid of it, right? And other people with an eating disorder hearing that might understand how profound that is versus somebody who doesn't have an eating disorder might not quite get it to the same level. All right, so group therapy tends to be incredibly common and helpful for dealing with the disorders. Was that a
Yeah. Negative parts of the therapy. It's like, and I think they get there a lot of things.
yeah?
And I was like, is this something?
It is mixed in that way, right? You get a group of people together who all have the same issue. Sometimes it can be a problem, right? I don't know why. I just thought, if you've ever seen Blades of Glory, they have all like comedy, right? They have like a sex addicts meeting, and then all the people are like looking up before and after the people all together. I don't know why I'm just getting in my head. I could have kept that to myself, but I didn't. But it's very common in that way, right? Where you get a group of people together and like it can lead to more issues, which is why it's so important for the therapists create boundaries and rules within that setting, because it can, right? It's like, oh, let me teach you things that you didn't know. Or like little tricks and like pieces of advice, or like, and you and I could go do this together right now and have somebody to do it with. And so that definitely can happen, right? Where groups can be counterproductive and they can also be incredibly helpful, right? So like anything, it's mixed, but that does happen with groups sometimes. You get a group all dealing with the same thing and they almost make it worse for each other. And I would argue that it's really the therapist's job to set that up properly, but sometimes you can't do anything else. Behavioral therapy, medication, right? Sometimes if somebody's underlying cause was depression, we give them an antidepressant to help them with the depressive piece, or anxiety, let's give them a medication to lower their anxiety. So treating the underlying issues, behavioral therapy is very much stopping that cycle, like exposure and then preventing a response. And as I said, said a few times now, like treatment can be really helpful, but the relapse rates are so high. And somebody has a trauma or stressor or something happens in their life, it can easily cause them to relapse. And that's something that people sometimes deal with, the rest of their life, that they're kind of always having to stay on top of it so that they don't relapse. And then I have this here as just kind of a side note, some documentaries and books that are about this, if it was something that interested you and you wanted to know more. The first 3 books are really easy reads, and then some documentaries like To the Bones, the newest one, it's on Netflix, and it's pretty good portrayal. Thin was the one that I showed you, but just some suggestions I'll leave up there for you in case you were interested. But as I said, I have a case study that we'll do together, and it's the front and then a little bit on the back. And I didn't write this. This is somebody else wrote this. But it's a very typical presentation of what this might look like for somebody. And so what I want you to do, I'm going to have you get into groups of 2 or 3, whatever, 2, 3, 4, whatever's easy around you. I have plenty if you want your own sheet for reading it, that's fine, but you only need to turn in 1 per group. And then when you get to the back, so you're going to answer, what are your reactions? Do you have any thoughts or reactions that come up? What are some of the signs that she has an eating disorder? And you can do bullets. You don't have to write out sentences. You can do bulleted things. What do you think influenced it? So what are some of the causes? And then what are some options for treatment? So just a chance to kind of pull it all together. So when you're ready, get into a group of 2 or 3 or 4, whatever's easy. Send somebody up to grab a sheet, and then you only need to turn in 1, but if you all want one, you can grab one for yourself. So find a group and then send someone up to grab that. Okay. So I wanted to remind you, if you're looking at the syllabus, right, the second part of your paper is due by this Wednesday night at 11:59 p.m. So I did that again on purpose because this week we have this and then next week we have the second exam before spring break, which will be online and we'll talk about that later. One thing at a time, right? I don't want to overwhelm you. But this is due by Wednesday. Remember, you're turning it in on Canvas, just like you did with the first part, just to save the paper and you don't have to worry about printing it or anything. So if you're on our Canvas page here, and if you click on modules, you can see here are the instructions for the whole paper and some sample papers underneath it. There's some information from the Writing Center, their handouts and all of that, and the library resources, which I updated. They gave me a new DSM link, and so I updated it on there if you would like to use that. But if you go all the way down to the bottom here, there's the recordings. Here's the paper part 2 under participation, paper, and exams. And so if you click on that, this is where you'll actually be submitting the paper. All right, so you click on start assignment, you can upload the file. Remember that it's limited to just these types. So if you have pages, you do have to convert it. But it's worth 40 points. As we talked about before, the really big part, if you scroll down here, look too far. So 10 points of that are the source. Remember that you need to give me a source that you're going to use for your paper. It doesn't need to be in any kind of formatting, but I want all the information there. So if you're using the DSM, don't just write DSM, give you the whole citation information, even if it's not in APA or MLA or any format, just make sure it's all there. And make sure it's an academic source. So not the textbook, not like Wikipedia, make sure it's one of the scholarly or like academic sources like we talked about. And then the rest of it, a couple of pages of progress. Again, I'm less worried about the formatting. I'm more worried about like the thought and the progress showing me that you're starting to work on your paper, right? I don't want you waiting to the last minute. So that's my goal with this. So maybe you have bullets about, different examples from your show or different diagnoses. Maybe you have some thoughts about causes and treatment. I'm looking for like 2 to 3 pages worth of thoughts, and you can give me more. If you have more, that's totally fine. I'll never take off for you giving me too much as a side note, but you don't want to give me less. Okay, so whether it's written out or more like bullets, either one is totally fine as long as you have a couple pages of progress toward that final paper. And then the source is worth 10 points. So really make sure you don't forget that. I would hate for you to lose those 10 points right off the bat. Yeah.
If you're doing information, can you suggest us to like analyze the whole TV show or just analyzing episodes that you like generally show?
Sure. It's totally up to you. So if you feel like one episode gives you everything that you could just focus on that one, or you can focus on a season, or you can focus on the whole show. Either way, you probably cite the show in your final paper, but it's totally up to you. I think I talked about in one of the classes, I have a person doing Harry Potter, and they used all the Harry Potters to diagnose him. Or you could just focus on both one, right, if you wanted to, or maybe one. So it's up to you, whichever works out best for what you want to say about that character as well. Are there any other questions at all about the paper? I'll remind you again on Wednesday, but I just want to make sure. Yeah.
Sorry, this meeting, I just wanted to make sure, is it single space or double space?
So I'm not going to worry about that at all for this one. Traditionally, APA format is double space, so it could be double spaced. It's probably your best bet. But as long as you have that content there, I'm not going to take off points for formatting. The final paper needs to have some APA formatting, and we'll talk about when we get closer. But double space is the APA style if you want to stick to it. It's probably best, but it's not a huge deal for this part. So I will remind you of that again on Wednesday because I see you before the deadline. But I just wanted to make sure you are working on it and thinking about it. And then when I see you Wednesday, we'll stop here rather than start chapter 10. We'll start chapter 10 on Wednesday, looking at substance disorders, right? So that's what we'll talk about for the next couple of classes. So that's it. Make sure you sign in. If you have any other questions about the paper, I'll hang out if you want to come ask me. Otherwise, I'll see you on Wednesday. Yeah, what's up?